Thank you, Music Group, for leading us in that. Thank you, Jackie, for reading. Can everyone hear me? Just checking. Am I on? Yes? A bit louder. You want it a bit louder? I'm on, but is that better? Yes? Maybe? Can you hear me now? Okay. Good. Thank you, Jackie, for reading that. I will be also referencing some bits from the second half of 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So please do have that passage open if you would. Now, have I got the clicker? I have got a slide. Aha, right. So, I wonder if anyone's ever been sold on anything that then turned out not to be quite right. Now, my sister-in-law uses, is it Temu? Anyone else use Temu before? Ever heard of it? Yeah. And so it's got some really great things that sound like, it's a good price. Well, in this case, she wanted an urn for a family pet, a cat that had sadly passed away. And it was a beloved cat. And they wanted to put it in an urn. And so she went on Temu, found this. Looked rather elegant, looked rather nice. It was a great price, and so she bought it. Sadly, wasn't quite what she was expecting. She did the same thing again with a rubber duck, and if you want to see the picture of the rubber duck with her daughter, you can come and find me afterwards, see if you can spot the duck. Perhaps you've bought something, it turned out to be a fake. It looked right when you bought it, but it turned out it was faulty, maybe even dangerous. It wasn't quite what it was supposed to be. Well, something like that was happening in Corinth. And we're going to have a look at how Paul sets the scene. Paul characterizes himself as the father of the bride. He set this church up. We've heard over this series that if you look back to Acts chapter 18, he set up the church in Corinth. He introduced them to a risen Jesus, a gospel of salvation, and the Spirit of the living God. So the Corinthian church is portrayed as the bride of Christ, much like Israel was portrayed as the bride of God, and the church elsewhere is portrayed as the bride of Christ. He's not saying this is exclusive to the Corinthians, but he's connecting them to the true church. As Mike said last week, Paul sees them as the real deal. You can see, I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. And we see also that he wants to protect them. If we look in verse 2, he's jealous with a godly jealousy. He doesn't want them to drift away. He feels responsibility for them in bringing them to Christ. He wants them to stay faithful to the one to whom he has promised them, to the groom he longs to see them joined with, to Jesus. But to continue that analogy of the church of Corinth being the bride, they're flirting with other men. They're at risk of ruining that relationship set up with Christ by following someone else, by turning to someone else. And then there are the so-called super apostles. I'm going to do this, super apostles. Now, I'm going to use the word super apostles quite a lot. I'm not going to do that every time. But know that when Paul uses it, he's being sarcastic. He doesn't see them as better or in fact, we'll see that. But he's calling them super apostles because that's how the Corinthians were viewing them. And Paul sets these up as deceivers. That's it, deceivers. They're not just getting it wrong. They're not having some theological issues. I think we probably all have some of those at some point. But they're actively drawing people away from Christ. Paul goes so far as to call them agents of the devil. Look with me at verses 13 to 15. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, masquerading as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. It is not surprising then if his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness, and their end will be what their actions deserve. So why would the Corinthians fall for it? If Paul's calling them deceivers, they're agents of Satan, why would the Corinthians fall for it? Well, we get some clue in these verses. They appear as servants of righteousness. They've put on a mask of being an apostle of Christ. But that's as deep as it goes. What does this look like? Well, we heard last week that they were playing to the culture. Today's reading delves a little deeper into that. So let's capture what they're doing in 3 characteristics. They talked the talk. They were costly, and they were boastful. The super apostles were probably using almost the right language. We see in verse 4 that they speak of Jesus. For if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, they speak of the Spirit. They speak of the gospel. It must have sounded to the Corinthians that they were saying a lot of things that Paul was saying. But Paul is very clear. Paul was clearer than that. Paul is very clear. They're not talking about the same thing that he is telling them about. They're not talking about the Jesus Paul spoke of, nor the salvation that he directs them to, or the Spirit that he says they have received. Let's just pause and think about how society today does the same thing. What messages might we hear in the world? What messages might we even hear in church? Now, I'm not going to be able to cover everything, and those messages that you hear might not cover everything that could be talked about, but I imagine there will be some similarities between what the super apostles were saying and these modern messages. Success from discipline. Work hard, win at life. Discipline sounds like a good thing. Word comes from the same word as disciple. And we want to be disciplined, but it can't be that worldly discipline of just work hard and your life will be perfect. We should be disciplined in prayer, disciplined in our faithfulness to God. Or how about, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. How many times have you heard someone say this? How many ways are there to consider our spiritual well-being? In schools, they talk about our spiritual well-being. Yes, we're called to follow the Spirit. Doesn't that sound familiar? Spiritual well-being, the Spirit. But spiritual is too vague and dangerously diverting from the Holy Spirit who helps to align our lives with God. Or love like Jesus, tolerate everyone. I wonder how many times we hear about, well, Jesus loved, I'm just loving my neighbour. I love my neighbour. But how many times when we hear that, do they not actually live up to what God means? They talk of love, well, they're using the word at least, but they often talk about a love that's not recognisable as the love compared to that in the Bible. It's portrayed in the world as this warm, fuzzy feeling of good wishes towards someone else. In the Bible, it's portrayed as action, a dynamic shift to help people, to point them to God and salvation in Him. Yes, the words are there, but it wasn't the same message as the one Paul was talking about. The words are there in our society, but it's not the same message that we should receive from God. They were costly. The super apostles were charging money for their ministry. Their ministry was reassuringly expensive. I nearly put a picture of Stella Artois up there, but I don't know how people feel about it. Now, there is a feeling that if something is cheap or free, it isn't worth as much. If it costs more, people tend to value it more. There was a study once done in Europe where some students were asked to imagine that they'd accidentally purchased 2 weekends on a skiing trip that overlapped. They couldn't go to both. One cost $50 and one cost $100. And they were told that the $50 one would be more exciting. But they had to pick one. Surprisingly, over half of them said they would go on the $100 trip. Despite it being promised as less exciting, they would go on the more expensive one because they felt, we're going to miss out on something that I've paid more for. If I miss the 50, that's just $50 compared to twice as much. Well, perhaps the Corinthians are thinking, well, if Paul's ministry is free, how much can it really be worth? But Paul's ministry was not free. Look at verse 8. I've gone back too far. I'm now in chapter 8. That's not what we want. Verse 8. I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. The Corinthians weren't paying for Paul's ministry, but somebody else was. Paul's ministry was not free. It was paid for by somebody else. Likewise, perhaps the Corinthians had been thinking, if the salvation Paul is preaching is free, how much can it really be worth? But salvation is not free. It's been paid for by somebody else. The salvation preached to the Corinthians, the salvation offered to us today, is free for them and it's free for us because it was paid for by Jesus. And what a price he paid. Let us never forget that the salvation we can accept as a gift is the result of Jesus dying on the cross. If that's something you haven't accepted or something you need reminding of, I urge you, read the Gospels, talk to a Christian, find a course, or join a life group. Find out more about Jesus. Thirdly, the super apostles boast. Paul does some boasting here too, but he doesn't want to. He calls boasting foolish. You can see it multiple times. He calls it foolish, foolishness. But he feels he has to get the attention of the Corinthians. For example, he will show that his credentials are just as good. Verse 22, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. He's getting their attention and showing his credentials are just as good. But there are some key distinctions between the boasting of the super apostles and the boasting that we see of Paul here. The super apostles love to lord it over the Corinthians, to lift themselves up, make the Corinthians slaves. Look at verse 20. You put up with anyone who enslaves you or exploits you or takes advantage of you. They're lifting themselves up and putting the Corinthians down. Where Paul's motivation, on the other hand, is to bring the Corinthians back to Christ. Not to himself, He wants to make himself smaller in his message. He wants to point them back to Christ. It's always pointing to Jesus. The Jesus they'd accepted in the beginning, the Jesus they were founded on, the Jesus who saves. Paul also boasts about the content of his message as opposed to its style. In verse 6, I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, implying that the super apostles are probably very good speakers, very dynamic. But I have knowledge. The idea of the super apostles focusing on style put me in mind of a TED talk I once heard. If you don't know what a TED talk is, it's a shortest lecture. It's given to a crowd of people, and it's normally done by an expert. But this one in particular was about nothing. It was about 10 minutes long, surprisingly, and it looked like a regular TED talk, but the point of it was there was no content. And it went something like this. He said, I'm going to talk about nothing. I'm going to wave my left hand like this. I'm going to wave my right hand like this. I'm going to take my glasses off and clean them and put them back on. And then I'll ask my audience a question. Get them involved. By show of hands, how many of you have been asked a question before? And then I'll give you some numbers. 4. 24. 2.6 million. Those are real numbers. Just something to think about. And this is how he went on, talking about nothing, but sounding like he was talking about something. By contrast, Paul boasts of love in action. The super apostles weren't humbling themselves. They weren't debasing themselves for the benefit of the church. We can see that in verse 20 again, if we look back to where he talks about making them slaves. He even goes as far as saying, or puts on airs, or slaps you in the face. Paul's saying these super apostles, they're putting themselves first. Perhaps that slap in the face might have been metaphorical, I'm not sure. But Paul suffers. He suffers for the mission. He suffers heartache because of his love for the church. He could have stopped at any time. Could have saved himself some grief. But Paul wants them to know Christ and that he has been called to serve Christ for their benefit. Now, why is all this so important? Why should we care about how the super apostles were talking to these Corinthians? It goes back to what we saw in verse 3. Paul likened the situation to the events in Genesis 3. I'm afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the snake's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Paul focuses on Eve in this example as an extension of that bride analogy that he had just used. The same problem existed for Adam too. In the beginning, Genesis 2, Adam and Eve had a relationship with God. Then along came a deceiver. If you read the account in Genesis 3, the deceiver twists the words that God had given to Adam and Eve until they end up following the serpent rather than their creator. And what was the result? Separation from God, cast out of paradise, doomed to die. Paul implies that the same level of seriousness needs to be applied here. The Corinthians are already a church. He says that they've been preached Jesus, they've accepted him, but they're being drawn away from him from the relationship with God through him. And the result? Separation from God. Cast out of the kingdom, doomed to spiritual death. Therefore, the message here today from this passage, be careful who you listen to. Some voices will say, I will point you to Jesus. I will offer you salvation. Emphasis on the I. Don't let the boasting deceive you. Listen to those voices that make Jesus bigger and themselves smaller. I will point you to salvation in Jesus. That's where the focus should be. So remember, it's not come to Christ and done. That would be like a bride walking down the aisle on her wedding day and then having nothing to do with her husband. Or even worse, walking down the aisle, getting married, and then immediately having an affair. Remember, this is Jesus, full stop. This is Christianity, full stop. This is not a Christianity for the Corinthians. It's not a Jesus for the 21st century. It's the same Jesus, the same Spirit, the same God. And lastly, remember that there is a force at work trying to deceive you, to turn you from Jesus. So be careful who you listen to. Let's pray.